A haunting screeching sound recorded in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, a new deep-sea species discovered, and just what are supergiant amphipods? These are amazing discoveries found in the Mariana Trench. Back in 2014, scientists recording sounds deep in the Mariana Trench picked up something that left them feeling pretty uneasy. It was a bizarre noise, about 3 seconds long, starting with a deep moaning and then shifting into a high-pitched metallic screech. Take a listen. Pretty strange, and the researchers thought so too. They had no idea what they were listening to. Clearly, it wasn't just some background ocean noise, it had a pattern, which meant something was making it on purpose. But what? Well, when a clip of the sound hit the internet, people started talking about alien signals, giant deep-sea cryptids, and conspiracies like top-secret underwater military technology. And for a while, nobody had a clue, but after studying the sounds for years, researchers actually figured it out. Turns out it was a type of minke whale call, something scientists now call the Western Pacific biotwang. According to marine acoustics expert Sharon Newkirk, the low-frequency moaning part is typical of baleen whales, and it's that kind of twangy sound that makes it really unique. Basically, these whales have their own weird way of talking that nobody had ever heard before, but this call is unlike anything else from known whale species. They still don't fully understand why these whales make this sound or what they're saying to each other. And since it was picked up at some of the deepest points in the ocean, who knows what else is lurking down there, making noises we haven't discovered yet. The Mariana Trench is like an alien world right here on Earth, and every time scientists go down there, they find something new. On one recent expedition, researchers discovered over 100 new species. In one expedition, they found that many creatures nobody had ever documented before, just casually hanging out in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean. Some of the new species included strange deep-sea corals, massive glass sponges that look like eerie underwater sculptures, and a bunch of strange crustaceans. One especially weird find was called a squat lobster, a weird little thing with spindly legs, spiky shells, and big buggy eyes. Aaron Easton, one of the lead scientists on the expedition, said these findings just blew us away. It was almost baffling to discover so many new creatures. In some areas, we were finding species we'd never encountered before every few meters, end quote. And that's pretty wild, that almost every time we explore the deep, deep ocean, we realize just how little we actually know about it. Some of these creatures have been down there for millions of years, completely unknown to us. And it makes you wonder, if we're still finding new species now, how many more are still out there? Maybe there's even something really big that hasn't been discovered yet. Alright, so microbes don't sound as exciting as giant sea monsters, but hear me out. What scientists have found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench might be proof that life can survive in places we never thought possible. Deep down in the trench, a place with no light, insane pressure, and barely any food, researchers discovered entire communities of bacteria and microbes. And not only are these things surviving, they're consuming stuff researchers just didn't think they would be. More on that in a sec though. These tiny organisms mainly eat organic material that drips down from the upper ocean, and in doing so, they play a huge part in the ecosystem. That's pretty well known, but what's really crazy is that some of these microbes have developed ways to break down chemicals that are usually toxic to life. They've actually found bacteria down there that can digest oil and plastic, meaning that nature might already have a built-in way to clean up pollution, which is crazy. Some researchers also think studying these microbes could give us clues about how life started on Earth, and maybe even how it could exist on other planets. Because if something can survive in the extreme hellscape of the Mariana Trench, then who's to say that life couldn't exist in the oceans of Europa or on some distant exoplanet? Most of the time, deep-sea creatures are pretty tiny. The extreme pressure and the lack of food just means there's not much room for anything especially big to grow, but that's what makes the discovery of supergiant amphipods so weird. Amphipods are these shrimp-like scavengers that live at the bottom of the ocean, usually no bigger than your fingernail, but in the Mariana Trench, scientists found giant versions of these things, nearly a foot long. That's 10 times bigger than a normal amphipod. So imagine a shrimp the size of a small cat. Weird. Researchers first spotted these monsters back in 2012. They sent a trap down to the trench and pulled one up, and they were pretty surprised. Again, you go down that deep, it's more rare to find animals that grow that big. Yet there they were. Scientists still aren't entirely sure why they get so massive, but one theory is deep sea gigantism, a phenomenon where certain animals actually grow much larger in deep, cold environments. Whatever the reason though, these things are proof that the deep ocean is still full of surprises, and some of them might be a lot bigger than we expect. You'd think that the deepest part of the ocean, somewhere barely explored by humans, would be untouched by pollution, right? Well, no. Turns out, we've managed to trash even the Mariana Trench. When explorers sent submersibles down to Challenger Deep, the very bottom of the trench, they found plastic waste. One of the first things seen in the footage, a freaking plastic bag, just drifting 36,000 feet below the surface. Scientists have also found candy wrappers, aluminum cans, an old beer bottle. I mean, it's not necessarily surprising, but just let that sink in. We've dumped so much garbage and crap into the ocean that even in the deepest, most isolated place on Earth, it's still not safe from it. It's not just an eyesore either. Scientists have found microplastics deep inside sea creatures, meaning this pollution is making its way into the food chain. And since plastic doesn't break down naturally, it's likely that every new expedition will find more and more of it piling up. If anything, this is just a reminder that no matter how far away or untouched a place seems, human impact is everywhere. We just gotta grow more of those plastic-eating microbes. In 1998, search teams in a remote area near Russia's Kola Peninsula came across the wreck of a Hawker Hurricane fighter aircraft. These planes were flown by Soviet pilots during World War II, after being supplied by Britain. Records later showed this aircraft had been shot down during combat in 1943. The fuselage was broken, but the cockpit area was still intact, and inside they found the pilot's body, still in the seat. His feet were still positioned near the pedals. Parts of his flight gear were still on him. The cold climate had slowed decomposition, which is why the remains were still there more than 50 years later. He was basically mummified. And they were able to identify the pilot and confirm which unit he flew with, thanks to documents recovered from the site. Until that point, he'd been listed as missing in action. During World War II, American aircraft were flown to the Soviet Union through Alaska under the Lend-Lease program. The Lend-Lease program was how the US helped its allies during World War II by sending them weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. Well, one of those aircraft crashed in northern Russia sometime in the 40s, went down into a lake. For decades, no one knew exactly where it ended up, but in the early 2000s, search teams located the aircraft submerged beneath ice and water. Inside the cockpit were gauges, controls, wiring, and ammunition still in place. They also found personal items that belonged to the pilot, including paperwork and everyday supplies carried during long ferry flights. The pilot's remains were still inside the aircraft as well. Because the plane hit water, it wasn't torn apart in the crash or scavenged over time. It goes to show, though, just how dangerous these flights could be even when there was no enemy around. Eastern Airlines Flight 980 was a commercial Boeing 727 flying from Paraguay toward Miami, when on January 1st, 1985, it crashed into a glacier on Mount Limani in Bolivia. None of the 29 people on board survived. And for years, the wreckage was buried under snow and ice and made any recovery almost impossible. For decades after the crash, only small fragments of the plane could be reached by search teams because the debris field was spread across a giant icy slope and buried under snow. And as the glacier began slowly shifting and melting, pieces of wreckage started to poke through the surface. Climbers eventually discovered bits of the aircraft scattered over a wide area, along with personal belongings from passengers. In 2016, a few pieces of the plane's flight recorder housing and small sections of wreckage were recovered from the ice. Some human remains have also been found among the debris on the mountain as the glacier continued churning up parts of the crash site. And this is a super recent case. Well, a super recent update. The story actually starts in late December of 1943. A Royal Australian Air Force bomber was lost during a nighttime mission over Papua New Guinea. The Beaufort A9211 and its 4-man crew disappeared into rugged jungle and mountain terrain, and nobody knew where the plane ended up for more than 8 decades. But in 2025, researchers finally confirmed the location of the wreckage in the remote Banning Mountains of New Britain Island. Parts of the aircraft were found spread across a steep slope, and investigators located original factory identification plates that proved exactly which plane this was. In the debris, they found aircraft controls, ammunition, and bits of parachute harnesses linked to the crew's gear. The 4 young airmen had been missing in action since 1943. And across the European Alps, old World War II planes keep showing up as glaciers melt. Most went down hard during missions and were buried almost immediately by snow, locking everything inside. But over the years, as the ice has shifted, pieces have been surfacing. Hikers and recovery teams have found chunks of fuselage, cockpit panels, seats, fabric, ammunition, and personal items the crew carried with them. And along with it, human remains. The weird thing is, it doesn't all appear at once. One year you might see a bent metal panel sticking out of the ice. A few years later, a seat or a wheel pops out further down the glacier. The ice slowly moves everything along. Some of the planes can be identified from serial numbers on the metal or small personal items, but a lot of sites are still only partially exposed. But every year, glaciers are still releasing new pieces of evidence bit by bit. On August 2nd, 1947, a British South American Airways plane called Stardust was flying from Buenos Aires to Santiago with 11 people on board. Everything seemed normal until just minutes before landing. Final radio transmission was a strange Morse code word sent twice: Stendek. After that, the plane just disappeared. For over 50 years, no wreckage was found. But then in 1998, debris started showing up thanks to melting ice in the Andes. Climbers dug up engine parts, sections of fuselage, and luggage, and over the next few years, the glacier released something far more disturbing: human remains. Among what was found were 3 torsos, a foot still inside a boot, and a nearly perfectly preserved severed hand. The remains started showing up as the glacier moved downhill, rather than appearing all at once. They were able to identify some of the victims through DNA testing, including the radio operator. Investigators eventually concluded the pilots misjudged their position, hit the mountain, and were instantly buried by snow and ice. On February 7, 1968, an Indian Air Force transport plane disappeared while flying from Chandigarh to Leh. There were 102 people on this plane, including crew members and military. The last signal came from a remote mountain area in northern India, and then nothing. The plane was eventually declared missing, but in 2003, a group of mountaineers came across aircraft debris and the body of a soldier. The remains was still clothed, with documents and money still in the pockets. This confirmed the crash site after more than 3 decades. Since then, the Indian Army has launched multiple recovery missions as ice continues to melt. Teams have found engines, cockpit components, fuselage fragments, and more human remains. In 2019, another body was found, and then 4 more in 2024, but the wreckage is scattered across a wide glacial area, so recovery has been slow. But each time the glacier shifts, new debris is exposed, and they think more remains and aircraft parts are still embedded in the ice. In February 1942, a US Air Force's bomber aircraft ran out of fuel during a mission over Papua New Guinea. Crew managed to land in a remote swamp. Everyone survived and was able to leave the area, but the plane was a write-off, so it sat in the swamp for decades. When it was rediscovered in 1972, though, it was still mostly intact. The cockpit still had all its levers, dials, and switches. The radios were sitting where they'd been, and panels and instruments were still attached. Even parts of the wings and fuselage were mostly intact. But because the swamp was so isolated, nobody had stripped it or taken parts away, the way it usually happens with abandoned planes. People started photographing it and documenting it over the years, and the plane earned the nickname Swamp Ghost. But when salvage teams finally got to it in 2006, they shipped it back to the US. In July 1942, a group of American planes was flying from the US to Europe when they ran into a massive storm over Greenland. There were 6 small twin-engine fighter planes and 2 large 4-engine bombers in the group. The weather was brutal, with low visibility, very strong winds, and endless ice below, and the pilots just had no choice but to land on the frozen ice sheet. Fortunately, though, everyone made it out alive, but the planes were left behind, eventually buried by layers of snow. Over the next 50 years, snowfall kept piling up, eventually covering the aircraft under more than 260 feet of ice. By the time anyone even knew roughly where to look, the planes were trapped in a frozen mountain of ice. In 1992, a team finally located one of the fighters, later nicknamed Glacier Girl, using radar that could see through the ice. Getting her out was a massive operation, though. Engineers had to drill a vertical shaft straight down to the plane and then carefully cut into sections to lift it out safely. Once the sections were freed, the interior was surprisingly well preserved. The cockpit still had all the switches, dials, and gauges, and seats. Panels were basically intact. There were even small things like notes and logbooks that had survived frozen in the ice. After years of careful work, the fighter was rebuilt and eventually flew again in 2002, more than 60 years after it had been abandoned. This past July in Lima, Peru, workers were digging trenches to expand an underground gas network when they discovered two pre-Incan tombs, one empty and the other holding a body about 1,000 years old. Along with the skeleton were 4 clay pots and 3 carved pumpkin shells, probably used for storing food or offerings. Archaeologist Jose Aliaga said the designs and colors on the pots, quote, allow us to establish a connection with the pre-Incan Chancay culture, which lived roughly between 1,000 and 1,470 years ago. The person was sitting with their legs pulled up to their chest. Aliaga and his team are carefully cleaning the remains, studying every detail they can. Lima, which is home to 10 million people, sits over hundreds of pre-Inca and Inca sites, so discoveries like this aren't necessarily rare even. There's a sinkhole in southern Mexico that nobody in the nearby villages will go near. They call it Sac Oyum. Back in 2014, archaeologist Bradley Russell and his team decided to dive into it. And what they found was hair-raising. It became immediately obvious why there were so many ominous warnings and legends surrounding this place. There were bones, lots of them. From the very first dive, we had seen skulls, Russell said. Getting down wasn't easy either. They had to rappel 40 feet past huge stalactites and long tree roots. In the first chamber, skulls, ribs, and long bones were scattered across the floor. One skull, probably a woman's, had been flattened on top, a Maya custom. A horseshoe-shaped jaw nearby showed it belonged to a young adult, teeth still perfect. The second chamber was darker and even creepier, completely underwater and twice the size of the first. It held at least 5 more skulls, along with bones that had tumbled down after a chunk of the floor collapsed. And the way Russell describes exploring this place is terrifying. This is very technical diving, he said. You're crawling on your belly with your tanks against the ceiling, and there's no popping to the surface if something goes wrong. Now, why were all these bones down there? Why was this specific sinkhole believed to be such an ominous place for hundreds and hundreds of years? Russell thinks the people down there may have been plague victims, saying you wouldn't want them near the rest of the population, and you wouldn't want to drink the water either. Makes sense. High up in the cliffs of Israel's Judean desert, there's a cave that's earned a grim nickname, the Cave of Horror. The outside, it doesn't look like much, but inside it's twisting, with low passages that open into chambers. Inside, archaeologists found the skeletons of 40 people, men, women, and children who'd been hiding during a revolt, around 132 to 136 CE. These were Jewish rebels and their families, researchers said. They were hiding from the Romans, who'd set up camp on the cliffs above. They also found pieces of really old scrolls, including coins and a Greek copy of the Book of the 12. In 2021, new fragments turned up, written in Greek, but with God's name Yahweh in Old Hebrew letters. Some of the text didn't even match the Bible that we know today. In the garden, just a few meters from Leicester Cathedral, archaeologists found something very disturbing. Buried in a narrow vertical shaft were the remains of 123 men, women, and children. The bones date back over 800 years to the early 12th century. No one knows exactly why so many ended up in that tiny pit. According to Matthew Morris, who worked on the dig, their bones show no signs of violence, which leaves us with 2 alternative reasons for these deaths: starvation or pestilence. At the moment, the latter is our main working hypothesis. It looks as if successive cartloads of bodies were brought to the shaft and then dropped into it, one load on top of another in a very short space of time. He also estimated that the people in that pit made up about 5% of the town's population at the time. First, the team thought the pit might be connected to the Black Death, but radiocarbon dating places this more than 150 years earlier than that. That was surprising, Morris said. As far as we know, the bubonic plague did not reach our shores until 1348. So what was the cause of the mass deaths that occurred then, end quote. Even though the cause is still a mystery, there are hints about what life was like in Leicester back then. The bodies weren't just thrown into the pit. There was no sign of clothing, but their limbs were still together, which could mean they'd been wrapped in shrouds beforehand. While crews were widening a busy road in eastern England, archaeologists came across a massive stone coffin that had been buried for over 1,000 years. The coffin, weighing about 1,650 pounds, had been sitting along what was once a very important Roman route connecting towns and military outposts. David Harrison from Headland Archaeology said it was a fascinating find, and it's easy to see why. Stone coffins from this period almost never survive intact. Excavating it was tough. Teams of archaeologists and engineers worked for months carefully lifting and documenting the coffin to make sure nothing inside got damaged. The size and craftsmanship seems to show probably belonged to someone pretty important. Back in 2016, archaeologists in France dug into a pit full of severed human arms, hands, and fingers. The site dates back nearly 6,000 years. The discovery of Bergheim is the witness of a very violent event, which took place at a specific time, said Fanny Chanel, an archaeologist at the University of Strasbourg. The pit, called Pit 157, was about 5 feet across and over 6 feet deep. At the bottom, there were severed upper limbs, including hands and arms, some belonging to a teenager. Cut marks on the bones showed these weren't accidents. Someone had used blades or axes. On top of that, the bodies of 7 or more people of all ages were stacked in the pit. One middle-aged man had his arm chopped off and a head wound that probably killed him. And they weren't all from the same time. Over 1,000 years later, so about 5,000 years ago, someone added the body of a woman on top. And there were no signs of trauma to her body, so why was she placed there in such a long time afterward? Back in 2016, archaeologists digging near Athens at this old port called Phaleron came across a mass grave. People had known about some burials there for a while, but the newer digs turned up hundreds more, about 1,500 skeletons in total. Some were in jars, some in open pits. There was even a horse buried down there. One part of the grave was especially unsettling though. Around 80 people were lined up together. 36 of them had iron shackles on their hands. In a cave in northern Spain called El Mirador, archaeologists found the remains of 11 people who were killed and eaten around 5,700 years ago. When they looked closely at the bones, they saw clear blade marks, burn marks, and human bite marks. One of the most shocking finds was a child's leg bone that had been cracked open to get the marrow out. Antonio Rodriguez Hidalgo, one of the scientists who studied the bones, said this sort of thing happened more often than most people think back then, but this wasn't a case of famine. All 11 people died around the same time, and there's no sign that food was scarce. The evidence points to something darker, a kind of war ritual. The people who died probably belonged to an enemy group, and eating them might have been a way to wipe them out completely, both physically and spiritually. The cave sits in an area called Atapuerca, which has a long history of other discoveries like this. In fact, researchers say it's become the capital of people eating each other from back then, because of how many ancient bones with cut marks have been found there, and the oldest cases go back nearly 1,000,000 years. Almost 2,000 years ago, 19 Roman soldiers ran into a cramped underground tunnel outside the Syrian city of Dura Europos, ready to stop a Persian army from digging under the city walls. But instead of the enemy, they were met with a wall of black smoke that turned to acid in their lungs. They choked and died almost instantly. Simon James, a historian who looked at old excavation sketches from the 1930s, said this was a deliberate pile of bodies. The Romans had steered their tunnel to intercept the Persians, but the attackers had set a trap, lighting a fire with sulfur and bitumen that filled the tunnels with toxic fumes. Adrian Mayer, a historian at Stanford, explained that chemical warfare was not unknown back then. Ancient armies were pretty creative. Greeks burned feathers and blew the smoke into tunnels, and Alexander the Great's enemies once heated sand and catapulted it at his troops. So the Persians using smoke as a weapon, totally plausible, Mayer said. When Sean and Carolyn Tullier bought their house in Guernsey back in 2021, they had no idea there was a secret Third Reich bunker sitting 26 feet below their driveway. Guernsey on the Channel Islands was occupied by German forces during World War II, and the couple knew the area had military history, but this was something else. It all started when a woman who used to live in the house messaged Sean on Facebook after seeing one of his marketplace listings. She asked if he'd found the rooms below the house yet. And Sean was like, "There are rooms?" And that set off a dig that took weeks. Sean and a friend used an excavator to move over 100 tons of dirt until, as he put it, the ground just gave way and this doorway appeared. Inside, they found what looked like a preserved wartime hideout, a bunch of rooms, lined with bottles, rusted tins, and an escape hatch, of course. And on one wall, in faded German letters, were the words Achtung, Fiend hort mit, meaning beware, the enemy is listening. The couple ended up turning the place into a games room. Imagine a pill bug, but just make it the size of a small dog. That's basically what giant isopods are. They're creepy looking, no doubt, but they're very important. Whenever something big dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, like a whale, these isopods show up to eat it. A robot called Alvin studied one species and found out just how good these creatures are at surviving when there's almost no food. The robot watched one actively swimming around looking for seaweed that had sunk down. When it finds food, it uses these serrated mouth parts to grind it up. Scientists looked at the bacteria in their guts and found they can break down really tough materials that most animals can't even digest. Their whole body is just designed to squeeze every bit of nutrition out of whatever they find. Down in the deep ocean, food can be super rare, so you either adapt to eat basically anything or you die. These giant isopods are really good at making sure they don't die. They've been around for millions of years. Researchers using advanced robots found these bizarre underwater lakes sitting on the seafloor of the Red Sea, more than a mile down, about 1,770 meters deep. Yeah, there are actually lakes under the ocean. SpongeBob SquarePants going to the beach seems a lot less silly now. These underwater lakes exist because the water in these pools is so salty and dense it can't mix with regular seawater, so it just sits there. It's a bit like oil and water not mixing. These pools are absolutely deadly though. The salt content is dangerously high, and there's no oxygen. So if a normal fish or crab accidentally swims into one, dies almost immediately. The cells in their body just stop working. And there are tons of dead animals around the edges of these pools. But somehow, life still finds a way. There are bacteria and microbes that live in these pools, and that discovery is huge for helping us better understand how life works, because even in places we consider impossible for life, organisms can evolve to survive there. What you're looking at here is not a graphic. That big, long, wiry thing, that's a living creature. In 2020, a robot called Sebastian captured video of the longest animal ever found on Earth, estimated at 46 meters long or about 130 feet. Now, it's not technically one animal, but it functions like one. Scientists call it a colonial organism. It's thousands of tiny organisms that clone themselves and fuse together into one giant floating chain. Each little piece, called a zooid, has its own job. Some sting and catch prey, some digest food, some handle reproduction, but they're all connected and working together as one massive creature. It's built to catch as much prey as possible by spreading out over a huge distance. Off the coast of Los Angeles near Santa Catalina Island, robots found a massive dumping ground, 3,000 feet deep. The seafloor down there is covered with old barrels, thousands of them, sitting there corroding. At first, scientists thought it was mostly DDT, which is a pesticide that was banned because it's so toxic. And yeah, they found a lot of that spread across the area, but then it got worse. The barrels themselves contained radioactive waste. Stuff like tritium and carbon-14 that hospitals and factories dumped between the 1940s and 60s. Back then, people figured the ocean was so big that you could just throw toxic waste down there and it would disappear. Out of sight, out of mind, but no, this stuff doesn't just disappear. It sits on the bottom, rusting and leaking poison into the water. In June of 2023, a submersible called Titan imploded on its way down to see the Titanic wreck. 5 people died instantly. After it went missing, they sent ROVs down to search the seafloor. The robots found the debris field. Pieces of the hull were mangled and scattered around. The tail section with the company logo was still recognizable. The back titanium dome was there as well. Looking at how everything was spread out and destroyed, it was clear what happened. The sub couldn't handle the pressure, and it imploded in a split second. Most people have never heard of the Ventnor, and honestly, I hadn't either until I dug into this. It was a steamship that left Westport in 1902, carrying the exhumed remains of 501 Chinese men who'd lived and worked in New Zealand during the gold rush. These men had paid into a community fund so that when they died, their bodies could be sent back home. The Ventnor was supposed to make that happen, but the ship hit a reef and it went down. 13 crew members died, and every coffin sank with the ship. For over 100 years, nobody could find the wreck. But in 2012, a small team led by John Albert and underwater explorer Keith Gordon followed a tip from locals who thought they knew the general area. Their echo sounder picked up a big shape on the seafloor. The following year, they sent down an ROV, and yes, they'd finally found the ship. Divers went down in 2014 and brought up artifacts, but no bones. It wasn't until May of 2020, while a team was filming a documentary called Fallen Leaves, that an ROV slipped inside the wreck and finally found actual human remains. Back in 1708, a Spanish ship called the San Jose got blown up by the British near Colombia. It was packed with about $17 billion worth of gold, silver, and emeralds. Spain was using all this treasure to pay for a war, but it all ended up at the bottom of the ocean. People searched for this wreck for over 300 years. Then in 2015, they finally found it using underwater robots from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Robots took pictures of bronze cannons with special designs, pottery pieces, and gold coins all spread out over the seafloor. You'd think finding billions in treasure would be good news, right? But not exactly. As soon as they announced the discovery, unsurprisingly, everyone started fighting over it. Colombia says it's theirs because it's in their waters. Spain says they still own it because it was a military ship, and there's actually a UN rule about that. Then there's the Caracara people from Bolivia who say the silver belongs to them because their ancestors were forced to mine it. On top of all that, an American salvage company called Sea Search Armada claims they should get it because they did research that helped find it. So now nobody can touch the treasure. The Colombian Navy has their own robots down there basically standing guard over billions of dollars that's just sitting on the ocean floor, all because nobody can agree on who gets what. When scientists started sending ROVs down to explore the deep ocean near hot vents and trenches, they expected some weird stuff, but in 2002, a robot called Ventana found something near Monterey Canyon that was way weirder than anyone predicted. They were checking out a dead whale on the seafloor when they noticed these strange pink feathery things all over the bones, and it turns out these are worms called Osedax, which means bone eater in Latin. And that name is exactly what they do. The females burrow into the bones of dead animals to eat the fats and proteins inside. You can only see their feathery parts sticking out because the rest of their body is deep inside the bone. They don't have a mouth or a butt. Instead, they make acid to drill into the bone, and they have special bacteria living in them that break down the bone's collagen and fats. The male worms are tiny, so tiny in fact that they live inside the female's body. Hundreds of microscopic males can live in a single female. Their only job is to fertilize her eggs. So basically the female is this bone-eating machine that carries around hundreds of males inside her. And these zombie worms are everywhere down there, eating up all the bones they can find. Between 2015 and 2017, a research team working on the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology project was sailing along the Bulgarian coast, mapping the seafloor to understand how rising sea levels after the last ice age affected the people who once lived there. That was the entire goal, but while they were mapping the seabed, their scans started showing shapes that definitely weren't natural. One after another, these outlines turned out to be shipwrecks. There were more than 40 of them. John Adams, the lead investigator, said the whole thing was a complete bonus because they weren't even looking for ships. The area they were surveying just happened to be the perfect place for old wrecks to survive. Below about 150 meters, the Black Sea doesn't have any oxygen, which means bacteria can't break things down the way they do in other oceans. Adams said this environment has basically frozen these ships in time, and he wasn't kidding. Some of the vessels still have intact rigging, carved decoration. There are even coils of rope lying where the crew left them. The ships are from different time periods, from the Byzantine era to later Ottoman trading vessels. One of the most famous is an Ottoman ship from somewhere between the 17th and 19th centuries, nicknamed the Flower of the Black Sea because of the carved post topped with little petal designs. Using ROVs, the team has been able to study every inch of these wrecks without even having to touch them. Back in March, a man named Philip Morfin was out fishing in West Valley City, Utah, when something strange caught his eye near the edge of the water. At first he thought it was an animal skull, half buried in the mud, poked it with his fishing rod to flip it over, and that's when he realized what he was actually looking at. 2 eye sockets in the teeth I saw, a human skull. It was pretty disturbing, he told reporters. The spot where he was fishing sits next to a business park, not exactly where you'd expect to find human remains. Police showed up just after 7 p.m., confirmed that the bones looked human. Roxanne Vanku from the West Valley City Police said the medical examiner was called in to come and collect the remains. She also mentioned that other bones were found nearby, some of them partially underwater. Right now, no one knows who the remains belong to. Investigators are going through old missing persons reports, but Vanku said there aren't any unsolved homicides in the area. We're waiting for the medical examiner's office to conduct tests to try and identify the remains, she said. In August, an anonymous source was driving through the desert outside Searchlight, Nevada, when they came across dozens of small ash piles scattered across the sand. When they got closer, they realized they were looking at cremated human remains. About 70 piles of burnt bone and ash were found near a dirt road just outside the town. The person sent a photo to the news, who then contacted the police. The Nevada Bureau of Land Management confirmed the ashes were human. They're still trying to figure out where they came from or who put them there. It's not illegal for someone to scatter cremated remains in the desert, but the agency made it clear that, quote, individual, non-commercial scattering is the only kind allowed. Dumping large amounts like this could break several laws, especially if it's a business behind it. Just weeks before this too, a Las Vegas funeral home was shut down after inspectors found decomposing bodies that had been sitting around for months. One was actually there for nearly a year. Searchlight is only about an hour south of Vegas, so Around that same time though, a funeral home in Colorado was caught hiding 20 rotting corpses behind a secret door and giving families fake ashes. Why the hell? Why? That is so creepy. Anyway, is it possible someone drove from Colorado to Nevada to burn the remains? Maybe, but at this point the mystery has not been solved. So in Gdansk, Poland, construction workers were tearing up the ground under this old ice cream shop, and instead of just finding pipes and junk, they hit something else. A medieval knight's tomb. This was just back in July, but the shop had been there for decades and nobody had a clue there was an entire burial ground under it. Archaeologists were called in, and they found the knight buried with pieces of his chainmail armor still intact. His tombstone had a carving of a knight holding a shield, though the coat of arms was too worn out to make out. And that means no one knows yet who this guy was. They've already found more than 200 other graves in the same area, along with the remains of an old wooden church that used to stand there though. But now everything is being taken to the Gdansk Archaeological Museum so they can figure out who this armored mystery man actually was. In April of 2025, construction crews at Temple University ended up digging up human remains and old caskets. The site sits on the Old Monument Cemetery, which opened in 1837 and once held about 28,000 bodies. When the university expanded in the 50s, most of those graves were disturbed. Headstones were dumped along the Delaware River and only a few families were contacted. Now, decades later, Temple ran into the leftovers. Work stopped right away. Archaeologists, police, and the coroner were called in. Temple said they followed all the experts' guidance to handle everything respectfully. Historians say this isn't exactly a surprise, though. Seth Brugman, a history professor at Temple, explained that the cemetery had been a green space for the city, but the university claimed it was neglected so they could expand parking and take over the main entrance. In 2025, the conversation around climate change shifted from just worrying about, heat waves to realizing we might have unlocked something much worse. This year's global climate update in September showed that temperatures are still climbing. We're almost past the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that world leaders promised to stay under in the Paris Agreement. That's the international deal made back in 2015 where nearly every country agreed to try to slow down global warming, but a report showed things aren't going great in that regard. Carbon pollution is still going up too. Sea levels are rising faster than ever, and places like Asia are heating nearly twice as fast as the global average. But then there's what's coming out of the melting ground. That's really what we're talking about here. A United Nations report in July confirmed that thawing glaciers and permafrost are now releasing ancient microbes. Haven't seen sunlight for tens of thousands of years. Permafrost is basically frozen ground that's been sealed off since the Ice Age. It acts like a natural freezer, keeping old bacteria and viruses perfectly preserved, but more importantly, frozen and away from us. But with all the melting going on, all this stuff could be released. Researchers have already isolated some of these old viruses, sometimes called zombie viruses, because they've been able to bring them back to life, so to speak, in the lab. And they found genetic traces of stuff known to infect humans, like ancient smallpox-like and herpes-type strains. This immediately got groups like Greenpeace worried that these zombie viruses could unleash a pandemic. In 2025, scientists started realizing that the combo of artificial intelligence and synthetic biology, the same technology that was supposed to save the world, might actually be the thing that breaks it. The idea was that AI could help design new medicines, better fuels, maybe even clean up pollution, but it can also do the opposite. It can design weapons just as easily as it designs cures. Researchers started calling it the dual-use dilemma. Basically, AI has gotten so good at building and improving biological systems that it doesn't really know the difference between making a vaccine and making a virus. A Nature study from this year warned that AI programs can already design new proteins and genetic code faster than any human could. That used to take massive labs and teams of experts. Now, someone with a decent computer and the right software could, in theory, create something very deadly. It puts serious power into way too many hands. And then there's the other issue. No one's really able to keep up with how fast this is moving. Regulators are already behind. Some AI tools even create fake biological data, which makes it harder to tell if someone's doing legitimate research or hiding something. We've built tools so powerful we might not be able to stop what they can do. When geochemist Mengren Du piloted her submersible between Russia and Alaska earlier this year, she was supposed to be heading back up. She'd had about 30 minutes left of dive time, but then she decided to veer off course for one last look. And what a great decision that was, because what she found nearly 30,000 feet down in the pitch-black Hadal Zone was what Du described as amazing creatures. Clams and tube worms living where no sunlight has ever reached. There was an entire ecosystem where life is not powered by sunlight at all, but by methane leaking from the seafloor. The creatures rely on bacteria living inside them, which turns gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide into energy. A study published on July 30th in Nature revealed that these microbes can even create their own organic food from carbon dioxide. Du's team also found that Hadal trenches might trap and recycle massive amounts of carbon. It's the deepest underwater ecosystem we've ever found that survives on chemicals instead of sunlight. In 2025, it became impossible to ignore just how fragile our digital world really is. Earlier in the year, a company called VeraSource, which helps businesses check credit and handle payments, got broken into. Hackers stole the names, addresses, birthdays, and social security numbers of about 4 million people. Then a few months later, TransUnion, a big credit reporting company, had a hack through a third-party app, putting another 4 million people at risk. A lot of the time, the problem isn't the big companies themselves, it's the smaller companies they rely on. For example, hackers got into Qantas, the airline, through a service they use called Salesforce, and ended up leaking data for 5.7 million customers. Discord and Workday had similar problems. Basically, every time a company lets another company handle some of their work, it opens up the door for hackers. Some hacks were even more serious too, like the Williams and Connolly law firm, which got the FBI involved, because foreign hackers might have been behind it. Private legal info, corporate secrets, national intelligence, it's all at risk. When scientists at the University of New Mexico started digging into human brain tissue samples, they found something no one really wanted to find: microplastics in the brain, and in higher amounts than in organs like the liver or kidney. The team, led by toxicologist Matthew Kempen, reported that these fragments, some as tiny as 200 nanometers, have steadily climbed, with concentrations up to about 50% in the past 8 years. Kempen said this really changes the landscape, makes it so much more personal. He also pointed out that some brains from people with dementia carried up to 10 times as much plastic than in other brains. But does that mean microplastics are causing dementia? Well, it's not definitive proof. Maybe damaged brains just accumulate more of the plastic, not the other way around. But as for how the plastic gets in, it might come from food or water, say livestock eating plastic-contaminated crops, or fields irrigated with water that has traces of plastic in it. Construction workers in San Fernando, Argentina were digging for a new water system when they hit a burial urn. Inside was a human skull, but not one that looked normal. As you can see, this thing is pretty oddly shaped, almost alien-like. Even experts admitted the thing looked unsettling. The skull was taken to the provincial anthropology department to be studied. Scientists confirmed the skull is real, but no one agrees yet on how it ended up that way. One strong theory ties it to an ancient practice called artificial cranial deformation, where a baby's head was deliberately shaped using wooden boards or tight bandages while the skull bones were still soft. It sounds brutal, but thousands of years ago it was common in South America. Cultures who lived in the region between the 3rd and 12th centuries viewed it as a way to show their family's status in society, or to give the child a special spiritual or cultural identity. Physicist John Brandenburg once presented a disturbing theory. Data from Mars orbiters revealed unusually high concentrations of xenon-129 in the atmosphere. Now, on Earth, this isotope is strongly associated with nuclear explosions. Brandenburg argued that Mars may have experienced massive nuclear blasts in its ancient past, possibly wiping out life. NASA and other scientists dismissed his claims, saying the xenon could have natural explanations, but the fact remains that the unusual isotope ratios are real and still unexplained. NASA avoids discussing this in detail, preferring to focus on safer topics like ancient lakes. Whether or not the nuclear theory is correct, the reluctance to fully address the data makes this one of the most disturbing Mars mysteries kept quiet. Images from orbiters have revealed long, tube-like structures on the Martian surface. Some appear as collapsed tunnels or translucent ridges that stretch for miles. Officially, NASA calls them lava tubes, natural formations from ancient volcanic activity, but some of these tubes look unusually smooth and evenly shaped. A few even appear to be partially intact domes. Scientists have noted that lava tubes could be excellent shelters for microbial life, protecting it from radiation. Despite this, though, NASA rarely highlights these structures in public releases. Instead, they're brushed aside as geological oddities, leaving the public largely unaware of how strange and artificial looking some of them appear. Over the years, multiple rover photos have shown objects that look like fossils. Some appear similar to coral, shells, or segmented organisms. NASA consistently labels them as rocks eroded into strange shapes, yet the similarities to biological forms are striking. In 2019, one particular Curiosity image caught attention. It looked like a small fossilized sea creature embedded in stone. NASA quickly said it was just a rock that had been shaped by wind. The story ended there without further public analysis. A lot of researchers believe these fossil-like forms deserve serious study, but the official response has been silence. And for now, the possibility that Mars once hosted complex life remains one of the most disturbing discoveries consistently downplayed. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 orbiter snapped one of the most famous space photos ever taken. At first glance, the image looked like a massive human face staring up from the Martian surface in the Cydonia region. The structure appeared to have eyes, a nose, a mouth. NASA later dismissed it as a trick of shadows and poor image resolution, but here's where it gets a little strange. Later, higher resolution images taken in the 90s and early 2000s did show that the face was a natural mesa. Yet even in these images, the formation retained a strangely symmetrical look, just not common in nature. Some researchers argue that the quick dismissal of the face on Mars was a little too convenient. Instead of openly investigating, NASA shifted attention away, branding it an optical illusion. To this day, the face on Mars remains a symbol of how easily disturbing or inconvenient discoveries can be downplayed. One of the most controversial discoveries ever made on Mars is methane. In 2003, scientists using Earth-based telescopes detected massive plumes of methane gas on Mars. Then in 2013, NASA's Curiosity rover confirmed it. Here's why that matters. Methane is unstable on Mars and should be destroyed quickly by sunlight and chemical reactions. If it is there, something must be producing it right now. On Earth, most methane is created by microbes or geological activity. NASA originally downplayed the finding, calling it an impossible contamination, but in 2019, Curiosity detected the largest spike ever recorded, 10 times higher than normal. Instead of celebrating the possibility of life, or at least a groundbreaking discovery though, NASA quietly shifted focus to other data, often releasing statements that the methane might just be seasonal or misunderstood. Yet methane on Mars is still unexplained, and the possibility that it could be biological makes it one of the most disturbing finds quietly pushed aside. In May of 2022, NASA's Curiosity rover photographed a small opening in the side of a rocky ridge. The image looked like a rectangular doorway carved into the hillside. Social media exploded with theories about alien tunnels, secret chambers, or ruins. NASA quickly responded, calling it a natural fracture in the rock caused by stress and erosion. But skeptics pointed out the almost perfect shape of the opening. The dimensions were neat and sharp, unlike the random cracks seen in nearby rocks. NASA never released released further close-ups of the so-called doorway. Instead, the story faded from headlines within days. For many, this is another example of something bizarre being quickly brushed aside rather than openly investigated. In 2012, the Curiosity rover spotted something glinting in the Martian dirt. The small metallic-looking fragment stood out against the dull red soil. NASA first speculated that it was just a piece of the rover itself that had fallen off, but then Curiosity found more shiny fragments nearby. After some analysis, NASA claimed they were natural Martian rocks with reflective properties. The issue is that the pieces look distinctly different from the surrounding terrain. To make things even stranger, NASA stopped publicizing photos of the objects, stating they were not of scientific interest. This was suspicious. Why would a potential metallic fragment on Mars not be important? That incident left many wondering what exactly the rover stumbled across that day. Since 2011, orbiters have captured images of strange dark streaks running down Martian slopes. These lines, called recurring slope lineae, appear in warm seasons and fade in colder months. At first, NASA scientists proposed they were caused by briny liquid water flowing on the surface. That would have been groundbreaking because liquid water increases the chance of microbial life. But in 2017, NASA reversed its position, saying the streaks might just be dry dust avalanches. The problem is, the explanation doesn't fully match the data. The streaks behave in a way consistent with liquid movement, and some chemical signatures even hinted at salt water. Instead of aggressively investigating, though, NASA pulled back, calling the evidence inconclusive. The idea of flowing Martian water was effectively downplayed. In 2013, one of Curiosity's photographs from the Martian surface went viral. The picture appeared to show a small rodent-shaped figure nestled among the rocks. Its body, head, and even tail seemed distinct. NASA dismissed it as pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar shapes in random objects. But the Mars rat image sparked debate. Some researchers argued that if there really was small wildlife on Mars, NASA would not admit it without absolute proof. While the official explanation is that it's simply a rock shaped like an animal, NASA didn't provide follow-up analysis on the specific location. Instead, it was quickly buried under new photo releases. The unsettling possibility that Mars may have tiny life forms was left unexplored. In January of 2014, the Opportunity rover took photos of a patch of ground. Days later, the same spot appeared to have a new rock sitting on it that was not there before. NASA scientists nicknamed it Pinnacle Island. The rock looked white on the inside, as if it had been cracked open. NASA explained that the rover likely knocked the rock loose with its wheels, but the location of the rock made that explanation a bit questionable. Some researchers suggested it could have emerged from underground or been deposited by some unknown process. Instead of investigating, though, NASA shifted attention, insisting it was nothing unusual. The mystery of the appearing rock was left unresolved, quietly filed away as rover debris.
Next on our list today, we have the Hydes, or more accurately, the disappearance of Glenn and Bessie Hyde, who went missing in the fall of 1928. The pair were newlyweds, hoping to run the rapids of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in Arizona, making Bessie Hyde the first woman to accomplish the feat. Unfortunately, that never happened, because on December 19th of 1928, the couple's boat was found abandoned, floating upright and fully stocked in the river. The pair had been seen and photographed just a month prior to their boat turning up unmanned in the cold water of the canyon. They had been restocking on goods and supplies when Bessie was overheard wondering aloud if she would ever wear pretty shoes again. Well, there is no way of knowing if she ever did, because as far as conclusive evidence goes, the pair was never found. Although many years later, in 1971, a woman claiming to be Bessie Hyde stated that she had killed her husband Glenn in order to escape his tormenting behaviors. While there was some evidence to back up her claim, documents of Glenn's early life, which would have been pretty easily obtainable, and a weapon, the woman's story is widely deemed as just that, a story. The investigation of the Hyde's death led to the discovery of many bodies found within the Grand Canyon, but none of them actually belonged to the Hydes themselves. Theories about the Hyde's disappearance range from people believing them to have drowned in the river to believing that they were chopped apart by tribes living in the canyon. At this point, it's looking like we'll never really know.
Well, how could I not involve a big hairy ape monster on a list of scary discoveries? Yes, even the Grand Canyon is known for a mysterious creature. Arizona has its own version of Bigfoot, known as the Mogollon Monster or simply the Arizona Bigfoot. Sightings have been reported all throughout the state, but the oldest report dates back to 1903 in the Grand Canyon. The Arizona Republican newspaper came out with a story about a man named I.W. Stevens, who'd had a horrifying encounter with a big hairy creature near the canyon. He described it as having, quote, long white hair and a matted beard that reached to his knees. It wore no clothing, and upon his talon-like fingers were claws at least 2 inches long. So he'd come across this bizarre creature drinking the BLOOD of 2 cougars, and when the creature spotted him, it threatened him with a club and, quote, screamed the wildest, most unearthly screech.
Next up, we have one of the deadliest airline disasters in American history, which somehow occurred directly over the Grand Canyon and cost the lives of 128 passengers. The freak accident occurred on the morning of June 30th in 1956. Just 1 hour after departing from the Los Angeles International Airport, United Airlines Flight 718 and Trans World Airlines Flight 2 collided in midair above the Grand Canyon. Both pilots had somehow veered off of their designated routes and ended up flying at the exact same altitude in the exact same space at the exact same time. The reasons behind the crash were listed as lack of communication, turbulent weather, and flight rules. However, given the large number of coincidences that led to the accident, the crash of Flight 718 and Flight 2 out of LA holds an air of undeniable mystery.
Finally, we have the Thunderbird, a creature from Native American folklore. Giant birds with 20-foot wingspans, creating lightning storms as they flap their powerful wings. There have been reports of massive-sized birds flying over Arizona, though, especially around the Grand Canyon, some in quite recent years. One of the most famous stories, though, dates back to the late 1800s, when 2 cowboys in Tombstone claimed to have shot down one of these massive birds. The story goes that the cowboys were riding through the desert when they spotted this enormous bird perched on a rocky outcrop. They fired at it, as cowboys do, and eventually they brought the bird down. They managed to transport it back to Tombstone, where it was then displayed in a local shop for everyone to gawk at for a while. Again, that's not the only story. Over the years, many people have reported seeing giant birds in the skies over Arizona. Some describe them as having feathers and resembling oversized condors, while other people have said they've seen what looks more like some sort of prehistoric creature, like a pterodactyl.
Starting off our list today, we have the Great Unconformity, a strange geological phenomenon which has left scientists baffled for decades. You see, the Grand Canyon was formed over millions of years as the Colorado River cut through the Colorado Plateau, eroding the plateau, which is made up of 3 main rock layer sets, which each contain various layers of sediment within them. Each small layer in the walls of the canyon can be dated, and for the most part, it's pretty consistent. Until, of course, the Proterozoic layer suddenly jumps to meet the layer formed from the Tappets sandstone. There is a unconformity between the two. And by that, I mean that the Proterozoic layer, also known as the ancient Vishnu schist, dates back to over 1.7 billion years ago, and the next layer of sandstone only dates back to approximately 525 million years ago, meaning that there is a significant amount of rock layers missing from the geological record. And the missing layers represent a major part of Earth's history, so scientists cannot figure out a reason as to why they wouldn't be there. It's inexplicable and a total mystery.
One of the creepiest discoveries made in the Grand Canyon? Bones. Human bones. Something that happens pretty often, apparently. The amount of deaths that have happened here are almost impossible to count, let alone solve all of these cases. There have been tons of human remains found in the Grand Canyon that have never been identified. And some have been identified, but the circumstances of their deaths have never been solved. In 2005, the Cold Case Squad was formed in Coconino County with the sole purpose of solving as many of these cases as they could. The members of the unit are all volunteers, having expertise in careers like the FBI, the Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, forensic nursing, crime scene investigations, National Park Service law enforcement, and more. And some of these cases they're looking into go all the way back to 1955.
From bones to no bones, another great mystery of the Grand Canyon, America's greatest canyon, is a distinct lack of not only rock layers but also dinosaur bones. That's right, despite its ancient origins, dinosaur bones have yet to be found within the rocks of the Grand Canyon. While at first this seems like it could possibly be one of the world's greatest mysteries, there is actually an explanation as to why no dinosaur fossils or bones exist in the area. And that is because while the canyon itself likely does not predate the dinosaurs, the rocks in which the canyon was carved from do. In fact, in some instances, the rocks in the canyon are billions of years older than the oldest recorded dinosaurs. So while the lack of dinosaur fossils isn't necessarily unexplainable, it's still pretty interesting.
Next up, we have the story of the cursed blanket. The story goes that in the spring of 1879, a trader named Don McGuire crossed the Colorado River on his way back to Utah. He'd been finishing up a trading trip in northern Arizona. At the ferry, he met a woman named Emma Lee, who was running the ferry. She needed some of McGuire's goods, and in exchange, she offered him a beautiful Navajo blanket. But according to her, the blanket had a bit of a dark history. Emma told him after they made their trade that her late husband's luck had taken a turn for the worse as soon as he got the blanket. Not sure why she'd say this after having just made a trade. Wouldn't really sell me on it, but I guess, a trade's a trade. It was too late. McGuire wasn't superstitious anyway, though, and didn't believe in any kind of curse. But in the end, McGuire would end up writing that the blanket was a, quote, curse to all who possess it. His luck started getting bad. He began chronicling all his bad fortune, writing that he had suffered, quote, 100 calamities. But as soon as he lost the blanket, his bad luck seemed to stop. He ended up digging further into the history of the blanket and discovered it had been woven by a Navajo woman named Mariana, who had made it for a stranger who rode into town that she had fallen in love with. Only her daughter had also fallen in love with the man. The stranger didn't return either of their feelings though, and the daughter ended up dying, according to the tale, of a broken heart. In a form of revenge, Mariana ended up cursing the blanket, and 3 months later, the stranger's horse was found with an empty saddle, and the blanket was found hanging on a tree branch, stained red.
Next up, we have the fact that the bottom layer of the Grand Canyon, located just below the Proterozoic layer, is made up entirely of metamorphic basement rocks, which are rocks found in the common household basement. Just kidding. They are rocks classified by their igneous intrusions, which means that either magma or lava has either entered and cooled or cooled on top of previously formed rock. This layer of the canyon is referred to as Zoroaster granite. The reason for the existence of the metamorphic rock is the Unicaret volcanic field, which was the source of at least 150 lava flows that poured into the Grand Canyon. Pretty hot stuff.
The story of Robert Spangler is absolutely wild. How this guy got away with everything he did is pretty astonishing. Every woman who ended up marrying this guy mysteriously died. Mysteriously. One of which at the Grand Canyon. So on April 11th, 1993, Robert Spangler walked into a ranger station at the Grand Canyon to report that his wife, Donna Sundling, had fallen to her death. He said that they had paused to take a picture on the trail, and when he turned back, she was gone. Rangers found Sundling's body about 160 feet below the trail. Her death was ruled an accident. Spangler was never formally accused of causing it, well, at least not for a while. But even though there was no way to definitively prove that Spangler was responsible for his wife's death, it was highly suspicious because 15 years prior to this, Spangler had another wife and a family, all of whom were found dead in their suburban Denver home in 1978. Spangler had managed to make it look like his wife had killed their two youngsters before taking her own life. So after his third wife had accidentally fallen to her death, Spangler started contacting his second wife again, Sharon. She ended up moving back into his home in Colorado, and on October 2nd, 1994, Spangler claimed that he'd found Sharon unresponsive in their house next to a bottle of Tylenol. She died later that day, and Spangler just happened to receive a $20,000 payout from Sharon's life insurance policy after her death. In 2000, Spangler was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he ended up confessing to all his crimes, all except for Sharon. He admitted to killing his first family because he wanted a new life, and he pushed his third wife off a cliff because he was unhappy in his marriage. Because apparently divorce doesn't exist. Anyway, in March of 2001, Robert Spangler was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, but his cancer took him out 5 months later. In 2018, construction workers in Alexandria, Egypt, came across a massive black granite sarcophagus buried underground. The thing was huge, over 8 feet long, sealed shut. It had been untouched for over 2,000 years. At the time, people online were joking about how opening it would unleash a curse or a plague upon the world, but the team of archaeologists, well, they just went ahead and cracked it open anyway. Well, what they found wasn't supernatural, but it was disgusting. Inside were 3 skeletons floating in this pool of reddish liquid. It was sewage water that had leaked in over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. As you can imagine, the smell was almost unbearable. The bones were badly decayed and waterlogged. There were no inscriptions or markings to say who these people were, which is odd. A sarcophagus that size usually belonged to someone important, but they were able to determine that the remains were of 2 men and 1 woman. Even though there was no curse, nobody was in a rush to drink the red water, despite someone actually starting a petition online to do just that. Yeah, after news broke about the find and the nasty red sewage water inside, some people online, half joking, possibly half serious, started calling it mummy juice, and someone created a change.org petition titled something like, "Let the people drink the red liquid from the cursed dark sarcophagus so we can assume its powers." It picked up thousands of signatures in just a few days. In 2009, workers in Dorset, England were digging for a road project when they hit a pit filled with bones. It looked to them just like a bunch of old skeletons, which was true, but once archaeologists got in, they found that none of these bodies had heads. They found 51 decapitated skeletons, all adult men, and nearby there was a separate pile of skulls. The bodies had been laid out pretty neatly, and they'd all been cut clean at the neck. This was not the site of a battle, it was an execution site. DNA and isotope testing confirmed these men weren't from around there. They were Scandinavian, so Vikings, probably captured during a raid. Their teeth showed they grew up in colder climates, probably Norway or Sweden. The carbon dating placed the event sometime between 910 and 1030, which lines up. There were a lot of Vikings in England at the time. And by that I mean years, not time of day. This is one of the most brutal Viking-era mass graves ever found in the UK. In 2015, archaeologists discovered a tomb near the ancient city of Amphipolis in northern Greece. The tomb was enormous and was decorated with intricate mosaics and sculptures, but the site didn't match any known historical records of famous burials. The main chamber was built with massive stone blocks, and inside they found remains of a lot of people. Some of the bones had battle wounds. The art was strange though. It was kind of this mix of Greek mythology with elaborate floral patterns and then images of sphinxes. The tomb dates back to the late 4th century BCE, around the time of Alexander the Great's death. But there's no solid clue as to who this tomb belonged to. Some think it might have been connected to one of Alexander's generals or family, but that's only a theory. The mix of cultural influences make it one of the weirdest ancient tombs ever found in Greece though. In 2009, archaeologists were excavating a 16th century plague burial site in Lazaretto Nuevo Island near Venice. They found a woman's skeleton with a brick jammed into her mouth. Turns out this was part of a very specific ritual. At the time, people believed that some corpses, especially of plague victims could rise from the dead and spread disease even after being buried. These weren't seen as vampires in the modern sense, but something closer to shroud eaters, corpses that supposedly chewed through their burial shrouds and kept spreading the plague from beyond the grave. The brick in the mouth trick was believed to stop this from happening. Belief was that by jamming something solid into the corpse's mouth, you of course blocked them from eating their shroud. In 1952, a peat cutter working in a bog near the Danish village of Grabel hit something soft. Turned out it was a man's body. So well preserved that people thought it might be a recent victim, but it wasn't. The body was actually over 2,000 years old. It became known as the Grabel Man, one of the best preserved bog bodies ever found. He still had his skin, fingernails, and even had stubble on his chin. His throat had been cut ear to ear, deep enough to kill instantly. There were no other injuries. This was likely a sacrifice. Bogs in Iron Age Europe were seen as sacred places, and a lot of bodies found in them show signs of ritual killings. Grabel Man was probably one of those. You'd still see him today, his face twisted from the moment he died, looking more like a wax figure than an ancient corpse. It's pretty eerie. In 1983, construction workers digging near the town of Thalheim, Germany, came across a mass grave filled with people. All of them had clearly died violently. Archaeologists found 34 human skeletons, all dating back to around 5,000 BCE, during the Neolithic period, long before cities, writing, or formal armies existed. Most of these people had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, probably from stone axes or clubs. There were men, women, and children, and archaeologists believed that this was a targeted attack, possibly by a rival tribe. Could have been a fight over food or land, an early turf war as farming started becoming a thing and people were competing over limited resources. It's one of the earliest known examples of mass violence in Europe, showing that warfare has been part of our history since the dawn of time. In 2016, a mass grave was discovered near Athens. Inside were the remains of 80 men still shackled at the wrists. Their bodies were lined up in rows. They hadn't been tossed in carelessly, which immediately stood out. Whoever they were, someone took the time to arrange them in a specific way, which is strange given how they died. The remains date back to around 650 to 625 BCE, a time when Athens was dealing with a lot of political tension. That's right around when a nobleman named Cylon tried to take control of the city. His coup failed, and his supporters were captured. Historical records say they were promised safety after taking shelter in a temple, but that promise was obviously broken, and they were executed. Some researchers think this grave might be where some of those supporters ended up. At Goyet Cave in Belgium, researchers studying Neanderthal remains found human bones that clearly showed signs they'd been eaten by other Neanderthals. The bones, which are about 40,000 years old, had been deliberately cut and cracked. Some had been broken open to remove marrow, others showed burn marks. They were cooked. Tool marks match the same kinds found on animal bones at the site. The bones belonged to at least 5 Neanderthals, including both adults and teenagers. The remains were mixed in with bones of horses and reindeer, all processed in the same way. Scientists also found that some Neanderthal bones had been reused as tools. This isn't the only site in Europe with evidence like this, but it's one of the clearest. We don't know the exact reason behind it. It could have been a simple case of, well, we got no other choice, we'll just have to eat each other. Their hunts were failing, and who knows. Could it also have been some sort of ritual though? There is a slight chance of that as well, but there's no definitive answer and there may never be. Back in 1973, archaeologists were digging at an ancient site in Iran called Hasanlu. The site had been violently destroyed around 800 BCE, and in the middle of all the rubble, they found 2 skeletons lying side by side in what looked like a storage bin. One of them had an arm reaching out, touching the other's face. Their heads were close together and they were clearly holding each other when they died. First, people assumed, well, this was a man and a woman. That's how the site got the nickname the Hasanlu Lovers, but it was later found they were probably both male. Nobody knows exactly what their relationship was, but it's clear They meant something to each other. They hadn't just been tossed into the same place. It looks like they crawled in the bin to hide when the city was being attacked. There's no sign of violent injuries on the skeletons, which means they likely suffocated. In 2008, archaeologists were digging near York in the UK when they found a human skull in a waterlogged pit. Then they looked inside and realized that the brain was still in there. Brains break down pretty fast after death, so thousands of years later, it should have been long gone, but this one had somehow stuck around for over 2,600 years. They think the person was hanged and then decapitated. The head was tossed into the pit, which was full of wet, clay-rich soil. This created an airtight environment, and with no oxygen, the brain didn't rot, at least not fully. I mean, it shrunk and it got a little yellowish, but it kept its basic shape. It's the oldest intact brain ever found in Britain, and it's still one of the best preserved ancient brains in the world. Scientists tested it and found that certain proteins had clumped together in a way that may have also helped preserve it. It's a weird mix of conditions that just lined up perfectly. Most of the body was gone, so the brain by itself became this bizarre little time capsule. It's rare enough to find human remains this old, but a brain? No one expects to dig that up. In 2012, in the small village of Bergheim, France, archaeologists found an ancient pit filled with human bones, specifically arms, hands, and fingers. This pit, known as Pit 157, is about 5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep, and it dates back nearly 6,000 years. The excavation began when an archaeological company was conducting surveys ahead of construction work in the area. While exploring a 5-acre site filled with ancient storage pits called silos, they discovered a total of 60 silos, 14 of which contained human bones. Pit 157 stood out because it was nearly filled with human remains, unlike the others, which were mostly empty or had different types of artifacts. The bones found in the pit included at least 7 upper limbs from different people. Shortly after these limbs were discarded, the bodies of 7 other individuals were also thrown into the pit. As for exactly what happened here, that's a mystery. Who killed these people? Why were their arms removed? Unfortunately, the answers to those questions have been lost to time. Not only was the Krakatoa volcano eruption of 1883 incredibly deadly, it also produced the loudest sound ever heard by human ears. People 3,000 miles away described it sounding like cannon fire. Here's a piece of audio recording of what it likely would have sounded like, not that we can mimic the actual intensity. The eruption began on May 20th and continued until October 21st. The most catastrophic moment, though, came on August 27th, when over 70% of the island and surrounding areas were obliterated. The eruption claimed at least 36,417 lives, mostly due to the tsunamis that it triggered. The explosive force was so great that it caused waves up to 120 feet high, devastating coastal towns and changing some landscapes permanently. The consequences extended far beyond Indonesia. The ash cloud affected weather patterns worldwide. The creepiest part, though, are the stories that surfaced in the months and years following this eruption. Large fields of pumice, a lightweight volcanic rock, floated across the Indian Ocean, and many of these pumice rafts carried human skeletons. One story goes that in July of 1884, students at a mission school in Zanzibar playing at the beach discovered black volcanic stones washing ashore. As they went to get a closer look, they were horrified to find human bones mixed in among the stones. Turned out skeletons had been washing up along the southeastern coast of Africa for almost a year after the eruption. In 2016, archaeologists excavating an ancient Greek cemetery discovered the remains of at least 80 skeletons found in a mass grave. These skeletons date back to between the 8th and 5th century BCE and were shackled by iron cuffs around their wrists. It looked like they'd been victims of a mass execution. The site is part of the Phaleron Delta Necropolis, an ancient burial ground that was uncovered during construction for a new National Opera House and library in downtown Athens. The head of the excavation stated at at the time that they were, quote, executed, all in the same manner, but that they were buried with respect. So the question is, who were these folks? Why were they taken out, and why were they buried with such care? Most of the skeletons belonged to very young people who appeared to be in good health at the time of their deaths as well. Is this a death metal album cover, or is this an actual archaeological find? Well, you clicked the video, you know the answer. Yes, this is a real wall of human skulls constructed by the ancient Aztecs. Archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History came across a tower filled with 119 human skulls while restoring a building on the site of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. This tower is believed to be one of the 7 that once stood in this ancient city, located near the ruins of the Templo Mayor, a religious center dedicated to the Aztec gods of war and rain. Researchers first thought the skulls belonged mainly to defeated male warriors, but more recent analysis revealed that some of these skulls belonged to women and youths as well. Archaeologist Barrera Rodriguez said that while some of the skulls may have belonged to warriors, others could have been from people used in sacrificial ceremonies. In Aztec culture, human sacrifices were viewed as necessary acts to sustain the gods and, by extension, protect the universe itself. Rukpend Lake in the Himalayas of India has a pretty ominous nickname. It's often referred to as Skeleton Lake, and that's because, for a brief period during the summer, the frozen surface of the lake melts, revealing hundreds of human skeletons lying at the bottom. The skeletons were first reported in the 19th century, but gained more attention when a game reserve ranger came across the remains again in 1942. At the time, the belief was that the skeletons belonged to Japanese soldiers, but it turned out the remains were much older. In 2004, it was discovered that these bones dated back to around 850 CE and belonged to 2 distinct groups of people. Most likely they were killed by a severe hailstorm, as analysis showed that a lot of them had suffered blunt force trauma to their upper bodies. How wild does this look? This is the skeleton of a prehistoric man that's grown into the cave where he died. Gnarly. He was later dubbed the Altamura Man, but who was he? Well, the Altamura Man is actually the most complete Neanderthal fossil ever discovered. In 1993, cave explorers came across the bones in the Lamalunga cave near Altamura, Italy. They found an upside-down human skull embedded in rock, along with many other bones. The skull was covered in shiny mineral deposits known as coralloid. This gave them some indication of how old the remains were. Scientists believe the Altamura Man fell into a sinkhole and got trapped. Obviously, he never managed to escape. Over time, calcium deposits in cave formations sealed his body, turning it into a kind of natural tomb. Researchers eventually concluded that the remains were about 130,000 to 172,000 years old, making this one of the oldest Neanderthal fossils ever found. 2 Dutch artists, Adrie and Alphonse Kennis, reconstructed what the Altamura Man likely looked like, which was probably something like this. Jamestown, established in 1607, was England's first permanent settlement in North America. From the start, things weren't easy. The colonists battled harsh conditions, disease, and food shortages. One of the darkest periods was the winter of 1609 to 1610. Known as the Starving Time. During this season, many settlers couldn't find enough food, and about 75% of them died. To survive, those who lived resorted to eating whatever they could, including each other. Now, there have been all kinds of creepy and bizarre things discovered at this site over the years, but one of the most grim was in 2012 when archaeologists came across the bones of a young girl. The bones were covered in marks that had clearly been left by blades, as if she'd been cut up and eaten like a steak. And a series of other human remains were found in a kitchen cellar mixed in with various animal bones. Most dated back to the Starving Time, so it was highly likely these poor folks had been eaten. Well, these folks look comfy, don't they? These are called fire mummies, human remains stored in a very specific way, a way that actually does make a lot of sense for saving space, but sounds pretty gruesome when described. The fire mummies of the Philippines, or the Kabayan mummies, are found in the mountain slopes of Kabayan in the northern Philippines, dating back as far as 2000 BCE. The mummies were created by the Ibaloy people, who would store them in caves. As for the mummification process, it would actually start while the person was still alive. Now, this wasn't a punishment kind of thing or anything like that. It would be done when someone was right on the verge of death. They'd drink a very salty beverage to prepare their body. After death, the body would be washed and positioned upright over a fire to dry out all the fluids. To further preserve the body, smoke from tobacco would be blown into the mouth to dry out the internal organs, and various herbs would be rubbed into the skin. Finally, the mummy would be crammed into a small pinewood coffin and laid to rest. It may seem kind of creepy to many of us today, imagining being crunched up in this position in death, but again, it is great for storage. You don't usually think of gladiator bones being found anywhere outside of Rome, but in 2010 an entire gladiator grave was unearthed in Britain. Excavations led by the York Archaeological Trust in 2010 uncovered 80 skeletons dating back to the 1st to 4th century CE. Most of these remains were male, robust, and taller than average. Most disturbingly, a lot of the men had their heads separated from their bodies, either having them placed in their hands or between their knees. Pretty gruesome. But it appeared as if they'd been buried with respect. Forensic analysis revealed bite marks on one skeleton, which had probably been made by a lion, tiger, or bear, another clue they'd been gladiators fighting in an arena with wild animals. A lot of the skeletons also had one arm significantly stronger than the other, a sign of intense weapons training from a very young age. The findings came from the Driffield Terrace site, where excavation had began in 2004. Dr. Michael Wysocki from the University of Central Lancashire stated, "These are internationally important discoveries. We don't have any other potential gladiator cemeteries with this level of preservation anywhere else in the world." Look at this poor fella. In 2014, archaeologists in Bulgaria found these remains at a 13th century Thracian site, the remains of a man who had been staked as a vampire. The skeleton belonged to a man who was likely in his 40s at the time, and an iron rod had been driven through his chest to prevent him from rising from the dead. His left leg had also been removed and placed beside his body, just to make sure he wouldn't be able to walk around if he did manage to de-stake himself. During the period these bones were dated, many Eastern European cultures believed that vampires were a very real danger, particularly when it was someone who died under what was deemed an unusual circumstance. So to protect the living, communities would stake bodies to make sure they wouldn't come back. This isn't the only corpse found to have been a so-called vampire burial. Far from it. Remains have been found across Bulgaria and other parts of Europe. At a site in Poland, archaeologists found remains of people buried with a sickle placed over their throat so that they rose from the dead, they'd lob off their own heads as they sat up. And there's something very cartoony, very Looney Tunesy about that method, in a definitely more grim, macabre sort of way. Now, what's the creepiest creature you can picture pulling up while fishing? Does it look anything like this? Well, if this is what you're imagining, then be glad you're not this next guy. A fisherman was left terrified after encountering a strange sea creature while fishing in southern Thailand on November 30th of 2020. Desha Srichai pulled in this icky-looking creature with long, spindly black legs that moved like a spider. He was shocked to see it among the fish and quickly recoiled in horror, throwing the net to the ground. He poked the creature with a stick before deciding to capture the moment on his phone. At first I thought it was just a twig, but then the thing started to move. I was scared and leapt back, Desha said. He showed the footage to his friends who helped him identify it. It's believed to be a dark black feather starfish, and these things really do seem like alien creatures, not just because of how creepy they look, but get this, if those spindly arms are cut, they can regenerate. Kill it with fire. Now he didn't though, he did the right thing and just knocked it back into the water with the stick. This news just came out the other day. Off the coast of the Philippines, fishermen made an unexpected discovery when they hauled in this mysterious ocean predator with large eyes. Originally intended for a local fish market, the creature caught the attention of visiting scientists, and it turned out to be a first-of-its-kind find. And it wasn't the only one. The researchers were focused on cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays. They were buying specimens directly from fishermen to study. Over 2 years, they managed to document 14 different species, including a sandbar shark, which was a big deal. This was the first verified sighting of this species in the Philippines. Sandbar sharks are vulnerable to overfishing, so it was important to get the data. They also found a pair of Philippine guitarfish which are critically endangered, and a few other species they hadn't come across before. So overall, a pretty successful 2-year study. From a now deleted Reddit user comes the story of the black shape in the fog. I've been wanting to share this for a while. It happened a few years ago when I was working as a deckhand on a fishing boat off the coast of Alaska. We were about 30 miles off, and it was one of those mornings where the fog is so thick you can barely see a few feet in front of you. Anyway, we were hauling in a net when I noticed something odd. At first I thought it was just the fog playing tricks, but then it started to come into focus, an enormous black shape, slowly coming out from the mist. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive and totally out of place, just suspended in the water, not really moving at all. The whole crew noticed it and just froze. We didn't know what we were looking at. It wasn't a boat or a whale or anything that made sense. It was like a shadow, but solid. It felt like it was watching us too. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the fog cleared a bit and it was gone. It was like it disappeared into thin air. I've never been able to explain it, and no one on the boat could either. I still get chills thinking about it. Next up is the Cabagon, a mysterious sea creature believed to live in the Antarctic waters near New Zealand. Weird thing about the Cabagon is that no one has ever seen its full body, only its head. But this head, if it really is a head, is described as being pretty strange. Large, bulbous, with 2 big round eyes and a set of nostrils, or maybe another set of eyes underneath. The most famous sighting happened on April 28th of 1974. The Japanese fishing crew were out near the Littleton Peninsula, and around 7 p.m. the entire crew, all 28 of them, saw the creature's head pop out of the water. It was about 1.5 meters tall, and it just hung around for a bit, almost like it was checking them out. After a while, it dove back into the ocean. The captain was so rattled by the experience, he made a sketch of the creature, which hit newspapers. Eventually, the mysterious creature was dubbed the Cabagon, meaning hippo monster. A fisherman named Max Manus made a chilling discovery last year while out fishing with friends off the coast of Florida. They spotted this small upturned blue boat drifting alone in the middle of the ocean. He posted a video of the find on TikTok. It turned out the boat had been abandoned after a group of 8 fishermen ran into trouble around 55 kilometers offshore. The boat capsized, and the crew used an EPIRB, or emergency position indicating radio beacon, to alert the Coast Guard. They spent around 3 hours in the water clinging to an esky before being rescued. Luckily, no injuries were reported. By the time Max and his friends found the boat, it had been adrift for a few days. They were about 80 kilometers out from Venice Beach, Florida, when they came across it. It was an eerie thing to come across, but at least this story ended happily. So news of this just came out yesterday at the time of this recording. It was supposed to be a normal day of fishing for Philip Morfin, but then he reeled in something horrific. At a pond in West Valley City, Utah, Morfin was checking the shoreline when he spotted something that looked like a skull. First he thought it was from an animal, but then he looked closer and noticed the unmistakable human eye sockets staring back at him. Morfin immediately contacted the police, and when they arrived, they confirmed that it was indeed a human skull. And when they continued searching the area, they found more bones, some partially submerged in the water. Investigators haven't determined the identity of the bones or how long the remains have been there. As of now, the case is still under investigation, with forensic teams working to piece things together. So whether this was an accident or foul play, it's still unknown. This next case is also super recent. News just came out earlier this month. So on March 7th, a group of fishermen were out about 40 miles off the coast of Boston. They were hauling in their nets when they realized there was something tangled in their gear. It wasn't a fish, it was the last thing anyone would want to find, a wrapped up, decomposing body. They immediately contacted the US Coast Guard, and the Massachusetts State Police took over the investigation. They didn't know who the person was, how they ended up in the water, or even how long they'd been there. As one official put it, no conclusions at this point. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner is conducting an autopsy. That may help provide some answers. Well, those answers came a few days later. Turns out the body actually belonged to a woman in her 60s who'd been embalmed and had cancerous tumors. That detail changed everything. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office determined she'd been legally buried at sea, which is actually allowed under certain conditions. So they closed the case, calling it non-suspicious. but that doesn't make it any less grim. Russian fisherman Roman Fedortsov has seen things most of us wouldn't believe. Bizarre deep-sea creatures that look like they were spawned from an alien, and well, take a look at this freaky thing. Yeah, just what in the hell is that? Turns out this is a creature called a smooth lumpsucker, and I don't think there's ever been a time where an animal's name has fit so perfectly. When Fedortsov pulled it up, he did what he always does. He snapped some pictures and a video and posted it on Instagram, where people immediately started comparing it to everything from sci-fi aliens to mutated Pokemon. The fisherman who works on a trawler based out of Murmansk regularly shares his discoveries from the deep sea, where the pressure is high, the light is almost non-existent, and evolution has taken some seriously weird turns, as you can see. Now, many of these creatures suffer from barotrauma when brought to the surface, meaning their eyes bulge, their bodies swell up, and their organs sometimes just explode, and that's why some of them look weirder out of the water than they do in their natural habitat. So imagine pulling up a shark, a pretty decent catch, but then when you cut into it, you find something absolutely horrifying inside. Well, in 2024, fishermen in East Timor hauled in a shark. When they cut it open, they made a gruesome discovery. There were human remains in its stomach. According to reports, the body parts were suspected to belong to an American tourist who'd gone missing during a diving trip in Indonesia. The tourist had been swept away by strong currents. Now, this isn't the first time sharks have been found with human remains inside, but it never gets any less disturbing. These predators don't typically hunt humans, but if a body ends up in the water, a shark isn't going to pass up an easy meal. In 1996, the F-174, a ship carrying migrants, sank off the coast of Portopalo, Italy. There were only 30 survivors. The rest of the passengers, around 283, sank with the ship. That same year, fishermen off the coast of Portopalo, Italy started pulling up more than just fish. At first, it was just a body part here, a piece of clothing there. Then entire corpses started showing up in their nets. Now, instead of reporting these gruesome finds, most of them did something unthinkable. They threw the bodies back. Now, they weren't just being callous, they were afraid. If they reported the bodies, their boats could be seized for investigation, their livelihoods put on hold indefinitely, so they made the decision to keep quiet. Then in 2001, fisherman Salvatore Lupo found a body part with an ID card. When he alerted the authorities, they didn't take him seriously. They didn't want to deal with the mess or lose their fishing season, so they just ignored the reports. Journalist Giovanni Maria Bellu eventually investigated the wreck and filmed the site using an underwater vehicle in 2001. The footage showed the damaged ship with skeletons still inside, but since the ship sank in international waters, Italian authorities couldn't really do anything about it, and for years the disaster was buried. And when the story started to come out, many people, especially in the fishing community, weren't too thrilled. Some even blamed those who tried to expose the truth, thinking it would ruin their town's reputation.
Inside a mine, explorers found an entire ghost town preserved like a time capsule. The Sterling Mine Complex in Oregon shut down in the 1950s. The entrances collapsed a few times over the decades, but in 1999, a group of experienced mine explorers accessed one of the deeper tunnels and discovered something shocking. Past the first few hundred feet deep inside the mountain, they stepped into a massive open cavern that once served as a staging area for miners. Inside the cavern were dozens of wooden structures. There were lockers, handwritten chalkboards, rusted cooking stoves, old boots still lined up on wooden shelves, and a first aid station with supplies still sitting on the table. Some spots even had newspapers from the 1940s that were still readable. It looked like the entire crew simply walked out one day and just never came back. Because the cavern was sealed from sunlight and moisture, everything was like it was frozen in time. Every canary brought inside dropped instantly. In 1980, a mining inspection team entered an abandoned silver mine in Idaho after locals complained about a strange smell drifting out of the entrance. As soon as the team carried in their air testing birds, the animals collapsed. They had not flown around or struggled, they simply fell from their perches. When the team tested the air, they found dangerously high levels of hydrogen sulfide. The concentration was so high that even brief exposure could knock someone unconscious. But the strange part was that the mine had not been active for decades, and there were no geological signs the gas should have accumulated in those amounts. Experts eventually concluded that a slow buildup of decaying organic material deep in the lower chambers had created a pocket of gas that rose upward over time, but no one could explain why the levels were so extreme or why they had suddenly begun venting toward the entrance. The mine was sealed permanently, and locals have reported for years that during hot summers, the smell still leaks out. A cave-in led to bones no one expected to be that large. In 1965, a collapse inside the Lovelock Cave mining area in Nevada exposed a small chamber filled with massive bones. Workers initially believed they had uncovered the remains of cattle or horses that had fallen from the surface, but when archaeologists examined them, they realized the bones were much older and not from any domesticated animal. The remains belonged to giant Pliocene-era animals that once roamed North America. Several of the bones came from a species of ancient camel and a type of giant, short-faced bear. The bear bones were particularly massive and were larger than the bones of modern grizzlies. The chamber had stayed sealed for thousands of years until the collapse exposed it. The bones were remarkably well preserved and showed claw marks on the surrounding stone, suggesting the animals had been trapped inside and died while trying to escape. Miners breaking through a wall uncovered a coffin where no burial should exist. In 1989, workers doing safety checks in an abandoned coal mine in Poland broke through a thin sandstone wall. Behind it was a small carved alcove containing a simple wooden coffin. The coffin was old, but shockingly well preserved given the humidity in the mine. Inside was the body of a man dressed in clothing from the late 1700s. The body was documented by local historians who confirmed the clothing style matched that period, but no one had any record of a burial taking place anywhere near the mine. Even stranger, the alcove appeared to have been carved intentionally and sealed long before the mining tunnels reached that area. The leading theory is that the alcove predates the mine by many decades and may have been a secret burial placed there during a time of conflict or disease outbreak, but no documentation has ever been found. The coffin was removed and the alcove sealed soon after, but the mystery of who buried the man and why they hid him inside a mountain remains unsolved. Explorers opened a side room and froze. Every inch was covered in shoes. In 2012, a group exploring an abandoned copper mine in Michigan found a narrow doorway they had never noticed. When they pushed it open, they discovered a room about 15 feet wide and 20 feet long, and the entire floor was piled with shoes. Some were modern, some were old, worn leather boots, others were tiny children's shoes from the early 1900s. Local historians looked into it and discovered miners used to discard worn-out shoes in underground storage rooms to avoid hauling them back up to the surface. The sheer number, though, was shocking. There were thousands, far more than the mine's recorded workforce at any single point in time. Even stranger, some of the shoes were clearly ceremonial or decorative shoes that had nothing to do with mining. This led to speculation that the room had been used long before the copper operation began. The true explanation has never been agreed upon, and the room has since collapsed, making further investigation impossible. The mine had been sealed for decades, yet fresh footprints were found inside. In 1974, a mine safety crew entered an abandoned iron mine in Minnesota to survey the stability of the tunnels. The mine had been closed since the 1930s, and all main entrances were covered with steel grates that were locked by the state. Once the team descended about 600 feet, one of the inspectors noticed something odd in the dust on the floor. Shoe prints, fresh ones. The pattern was clear and sharp, which meant they had been made within days, not decades. The prints continued down a long passage into an area that had suffered multiple cave-ins. The crew followed them until they reached a section where the tunnel roof had collapsed completely. The prints stopped at the edge of the rubble. The team searched for hours and found no one. No evidence of camping, no tools, no water bottles, nothing. They checked the entrances again on the way out, and all were locked exactly as they had been when they arrived. It started with a hallway carved in the wrong direction. In 2013, a group of explorers entered an abandoned gold mine in Arizona. They had explored this mine before and they knew its layout, but on this visit, one of the explorers spotted something new. A narrow side passage that was not on any of the old survey maps. The walls were different too. They were smooth and cut almost perfectly flat, unlike the rest of the mine, which still had rough tool marks. The men followed the passage about 30 feet until it suddenly stopped at a dead end. But the end of the tunnel was even stranger. Embedded in the wall were marks that looked like mechanical cuts, almost like a drill had chewed its way forward and then suddenly stopped. There were no signs of explosives, no blast marks, no leftover powder, and the strangest part was the floor, which had odd metallic shavings scattered across it. After the explorers posted their findings online, retired geologists and former miners reached out. None of them had an explanation. The tunnel did not match any known mining equipment in the region, and it was never explained who carved it or why it stopped exactly where it did. Because the passage was not on any official map and no company ever claimed it, it remains one of the strangest undocumented tunnels ever found in an abandoned mine. When an explorer poked the mannequin, the finger sank in. In 1976, two teenagers exploring an old mine shaft near Barstow, California, thought they had stumbled onto a beat-up mannequin. It was slumped against the wall, covered in dust, and completely dried out. But when one of the teens touched the arm, the material was soft, and they discovered it was human. Police later identified the body as that of a man who had vanished in 1971. He had fallen into an isolated shaft, and the dry desert conditions preserved him almost perfectly. The mine was miles away from any major road and had no warning signs at that time. The man had apparently been exploring alone, slipped, and became trapped in a vertical drop. The discovery was so disturbing that the country sealed the entire entrance to prevent others from going inside. Today, people living in the area still talk about the story as one of the most unsettling discoveries ever made in a California mine. A collapsed mine revealed tools thousands of years older than the mine itself. In 1914, workers in a South African gold mine discovered a completely unexpected chamber after a section of rock gave way. Inside were dozens of stone hammers, chisels, and pounding tools. These were not modern miners' tools. They looked primitive and handmade, but they were found in rock layers that were already being mined with dynamite and steel equipment. What shocked the mining company was the age. Geologists who examined the surrounding rock later reported that the layer the tools were found in dated back hundreds of thousands of years. The tools did not match any known culture and looked far older than anything humans were supposed to be making at that time. They were removed, cataloged, and quietly stored away, but photos sometimes still circulate online. The mine workers insisted the tools were found exactly where they appeared. Many scientists dispute the interpretation, but the discovery remains one of the most debated archaeological finds ever uncovered inside of a mine. Explorers thought they were looking at rocks until one moved. In 2005, a group exploring a long-abandoned lead mine in Wales recorded something unusual. They kept seeing pale shapes on the ground. At first, they thought the shapes were bits of ore or limestone, but then the shapes scurried. They had stumbled onto a population of albino cave insects and rodents that had adapted to the pitch-black environment, but they also found something even stranger. Several of the rodents were missing their eyes entirely, not damaged or injured, just no eyeballs at all. Their skulls were smooth where the eye sockets should have been. Biologists later confirmed this was a known but rare mutation that occurs in animals isolated in complete darkness for many generations. The mine had been sealed for decades, which meant an entire colony had adapted underground without human interference. Even the biologists who studied them said the sight was disturbing. Seeing mammals with no eyes moving confidently through absolute darkness made the explorers rethink what can evolve in abandoned places humans never return to.
What you're looking at here is not CGI. Scientists actually caught the Earth's crust moving like it was breathing. It happened in a remote forest in Quebec, Canada, where a group hiking near the shore noticed the ground beneath the trees pulsing up and down like a giant lung. And they weren't just seeing things, Video of it went viral, and experts have confirmed it's real, and it's still happening during heavy storms. So what exactly is going on here? Well, according to geologists, it's caused by high winds hitting the forest canopy during extreme weather, and the pressure on the saturated ground makes it flex in and out like a sponge. The roots of the trees are what's lifting the ground in those waves, but even knowing that, it's weird to watch. Looks like the world is ending. Reminds me of something out of a never-ending story. In early 2023, archaeologists in Slovakia were digging around a Neolithic site with a name I can't pronounce when they found something pretty unsettling. Buried in a long trench were the remains of 38 people, and nearly every single one of them was missing their head. The bodies had just been tossed in, no real care, like garbage. There were no signs of weapons or trauma, aside from the fact that they had no heads. It was just clean decapitations, and this settlement is around 7,000 years old, so we're talking way before organized warfare as we know it. Some of the bodies were stacked on top of each other, others were crammed in sideways. Everything about this site screams that something very intentional happened here. I mean, how do 38 people just randomly lose their heads? Nobody's sure what happened exactly though. According to archaeologist Martin Furtholt, even the experts were shocked. We assumed to find more human skeletons, but this exceeded all imaginations, he said. And yeah, that's putting it mildly. Some think it could have been a ritual of some kind, others say maybe it was a mass punishment, but the truth is, no one really knows. In 2024, a team of archaeologists digging in an old compound in Poland found something incredibly disturbing. 5 skeletons buried just below what used to be the wooden floors of a house once lived in by Hermann Göring, a high-ranking member of the Third Reich. The place was part of the Wolf's Lair, a massive, heavily guarded military base where Adolf and his inner circle ran operations on the Eastern Front. The skeletons were found buried in a neat row. All of them were missing their hands and feet. They were buried so close to the surface that one of the skulls was found just 10 centimeters below ground. One of the archaeologists, Marek Bartosłęcki, said they were shocked because the remains were so shallow they should have been noticed during earlier work done in the area. There were no signs of injuries from weapons specifically, so whatever happened to them either came after death or was done in a way that just didn't leave marks on the bone. The fact that this was found under the home of one of the Third Reich's most powerful men, though, just makes this find all the more sickening. So in July of 2025, health officials in Kerala, India confirmed that a 32-year-old man tested positive for Nipah virus after caring for his dying father who also had it. That is scary enough, but this virus is no joke. It has a fatality rate of up to 75%. It's actually the disease that inspired the movie Contagion. The 32-year-old had been under watch after his father died, and when he started showing symptoms, it triggered a full-on panic. Health Minister Veena George said 2 more women in the area also tested positive, raising the total to 5 confirmed cases and 2 deaths. The state immediately threw up a 3-kilometer lockdown around the man's home, and as of now, over 700 people are being monitored. Nipah is spread by bats, and Kerala has over 40 species of them. Because rapid development is pushing humans and wildlife into tighter spaces, viruses like this are jumping over more often. What makes this virus even more terrifying is that it can cause brain swelling, seizures, and in some cases coma within 48 hours. And if you do survive, 1 in 5 people end up with long-term brain issues like personality changes, epilepsy. As Dr. Rebecca Dutch put it, there's no apparent treatment, no vaccine. Nipah is absolutely one of the viruses that could start a new pandemic. Next up, we have odd radio circles. Astronomers started spotting these weird things in space around 2020. Giant, faint rings floating out in the cosmos that nobody had ever seen before. They're called odd radio circles, or ORCs for short. And here's the really creepy part. They only show up when you're looking at radio waves. If you look in normal light, X-rays, or infrared, you get nothing. These rings are massive though, millions of light years across, way bigger than entire galaxies. And no one really knows what they are. They're not stars, they're not galaxies, not black holes. One theory is they could be huge shock waves left behind by cosmic explosions or mergings between supermassive black holes, but again, that's just a guess. First one was discovered by a scientist named Anna Kapinska in 2019 while going through data from the ASCAP radio telescope in Australia. At first the team thought it might just be a glitch, but then more started popping up and they realized, nope, this is something real. Professor Ray Norris, part of the team, said it best. We know what they look like, but but we don't know what they are, how big they are, or what's causing them. So basically, they found glowing rings in space that don't behave like anything we've ever seen before, and they have no clue how they got there. That's where we're at. So we've all heard about plastic pollution, bottles, bags, straws floating around in the ocean, but that's just the stuff we can see. In 2025, scientists revealed something way worse. They found that the North Atlantic Ocean is absolutely loaded with nanoplastics. Tiny plastic particles so small you need special gear just to detect them. These are pieces smaller than a micrometer, invisible to the human eye. This stuff isn't just floating around in water bottles or clinging to trash patches, it's suspended in the ocean itself, mixing into the food chain and maybe even into our bodies. One of the researchers, Professor Helga Nyman, put it bluntly, the North Atlantic is more yellow than blue when it comes to nanoplastics. Yellow, yes, as in there's more of this plastic dust than actual ocean color in some samples. These tiny particles can get inside fish, plankton, anything that feeds on them, so including us. Worse, there's no real way to clean this stuff up, it's too small. So unless we seriously rethink how we produce and throw away plastic, this invisible mess is just going to keep building up in the environment, in the rain, the air, and eventually us. For the first time ever, bird flu has officially reached the mainland of Antarctica. Last year, scientists found the H5N1 virus in 2 dead birds near Argentina's Primavera base on the Antarctic Peninsula. This is huge because until now, Antarctica was the last major continent that hadn't been affected by this strain. According to scientists, this strain of H5N1 has killed millions of wild birds around the world since 2021, and is now officially in every continent except Oceania. And it's not just birds, the virus has also jumped to mammals like elephant seals, fur seals, and a polar bear also was confirmed dead last year too. Antonio Alcami, a researcher from Spain's National Research Council, said the problem is how long is it going to take before it transmits to other species like penguins. We need to monitor that. I think it probably will transmit to penguins. If that happens, experts warn it could signal one of the largest ecological disasters of modern times. Alright, so here's something that's pretty messed up. Scientists just found out that our sewage, sludge, and wastewater plants are basically leaking toxic chemicals into rivers all over the United States. I mean, go figure, but it's an official report. They're nicknamed forever chemicals because once they're in the environment or your body, they're not going anywhere. These things are linked to cancer, liver and kidney problems, birth defects, all sorts of bad stuff. And it's not just trace amounts. A new nationwide study looked at rivers next to 32 sewage-related sites, stuff like wastewater treatment plants and farmlands, where that sludge gets dumped as fertilizer. Out of all of them, only 1 didn't have disturbing levels of forever chemicals in the water downstream. In 95% of the cases, levels were higher after the water passed by the site. That's a pretty clear uh-oh. Even worse, some of these clean wastewater plants are just pumping the chemicals right back into rivers. Detroit's Rouge River, for example, had levels jump 146%, and Dragoon Creek in Washington state saw an insane 5100% increase. And yes, this stuff is getting into our crops and drinking water as well. In Tasmania, beachgoers recently started finding piles of dead fish and rotting globs of salmon fat washing up on beaches like Bruny Island and Verona Sands. And I mean mounds of carcasses here. Locals are calling it a horror show, and that is not an exaggeration. The horror show continues, said the Bob Brown Foundation in a statement, going on to say Bruny Island residents have sent us shocking images. Salmon fat littering the pristine beaches with whole salmon carcasses also washing ashore. Yeah, imagine going for a swim and stepping into that gunk. It gives me the shivers. Turns out the salmon industry is in a mess right now because of a nasty outbreak of something called rickettsia-like organisms, bacteria that causes everything from ulcers and liver damage to brain inflammation and bleeding, spreading through fish farms and causing what officials call elevated mortality events. So, translation, tons of salmon are dying off. Environmentalists are pretty furious. This is evidence of an industry completely out of control, said marine campaigner Alistair Allen. All these factory farms do is cause pollution, suffering, and death on Tasmania's unique waterways. End quote. The salmon companies agree that this is bad, but they also say they're not trying to cover anything up. As Salmon Tasmania CEO Luke Martin put it, these images do not show anything the industry has not already been very upfront and open about. So here's something most people still aren't talking about, but probably should be. A super fungus called Candida auris is quietly becoming a nightmare in hospitals. It's not just hard to treat, it's resistant to multiple treatments, which basically means once it gets in your system, there's not much doctors can do. What's even creepier is that experts think climate change helped it evolve to handle heat, specifically human body heat. Most fungi can't survive inside us because it's too warm, but Candida auris adapted somehow. And it's doing pretty well. It first showed up in 2009, but by 2025 it's become a major global problem. Hospitals in the US, UK, and other countries are seeing more and more cases of this. According to Dr. Manu de Rijker, one of the lead scientists working on this, he said there are, quote, no treatments for those people, which is not something you want to hear from a researcher. The people most at risk are already in the hospital, people on ventilators with catheters, people who have weakened immune systems already, so sure, it's not wiping out healthy people, but it's hitting the vulnerable when they're already down. And that's pretty bad. Down in the Mariana Trench, there's something lurking that isn't a fish, isn't a squid, and honestly, doesn't even look like it should be alive. It's called a xenophyophore, which is basically a massive deep-sea amoeba. Scientists describe them as giant single-celled organisms that can grow up to 4 inches across. Think about that for a second. One cell the size of your palm. They absorb and trap particles in their environment, forming an outer shell made of whatever junk is floating around. Lead, uranium, mercury. If it's toxic, there's a good chance these things are covered in it. Scientists think their ability to thrive in extreme environments makes them important players in deep-sea ecosystems, but they're also basically living biohazards. One study from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography found they're, quote, highly resistant to heavy metal contamination, but they may also help indicate pollution levels in deep-sea trenches, which is kind of cool. Here's another crazy thing though. Xenophyophores are capable of regenerating even if you cut them apart. They can pull themselves back together, kind of like a deep-sea version of the Thing. Back in 2017, Australian researchers were dragging a net through the deep waters near the Mariana Trench when they pulled up something that just looked wrong. It had no eyes, no visible mouth, just a smooth, pale body with a weird, wrinkled texture. At first, scientists weren't even sure what they were looking at, but after some examination, they realized it was a species of cusk eel, one that hadn't been seen in over a century. The official name is Typhlonus nassus, aka the faceless cusk. Now, is it actually faceless? Well, yes and no. It has a mouth, it just isn't where you'd expect. Instead of being on where its face should be, it's found on the underside of its body. It doesn't have eyes though. Since it lives at depths of over 13,000 feet, where it's pitch black 24/7, eyesight is pretty much useless. Instead, the faceless cusk eel uses vibrations and chemical signals to detect its prey. Dr. Tim O'Hara, who is leading the expedition that rediscovered the eel, described it as, quote, probably the strangest deep-sea fish we've collected. And considering they also pulled up spiky sea cucumbers and bizarre carnivorous sponges on that same trip, that's really saying something. Nuclear explosives tests from the 50s and 60s didn't just leave their mark on the land and the atmosphere, they also made it all the way down to the deepest parts of the ocean. Researchers analyzing deep-sea crustaceans found something very alarming: high levels of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope released by nuclear explosions. Some of these creatures live more than 35,000 feet below the surface, in a place humans have never directly impacted. Dr. Ning Wang, who led a study on this, explained, the bomb carbon has reached the deepest oceanic ecosystems, indicating the strong influence of humanity on Earth, end quote. In other words, the effects of nuclear weapons have literally seeped into parts of the planet we thought were untouched. What's even stranger is how fast it happened. The radioactive carbon showed up in deep-sea trenches just a few decades after the tests, meaning there's some kind of rapid biological conveyor belt moving surface contaminants straight to the ocean floor, which is then seeping into the food chain. Tiny creatures at the bottom of the trench are absorbing bomb carbon and bigger animals are eating them. In 2021, researchers exploring the depths of the Mariana Trench were scanning the ocean floor when they saw something that made them jump. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't a shark, it was just a tentacle. A very long tentacle, stretching out of the darkness. There was no visible body attached to it, just a single ghostly limb. Deep-sea biologist Dr. Alan Jameson, who reviewed the footage, admitted that nobody really knows what it belonged to. The best guess, it could be an unknown species of big fin squid, which have massive spindly arms that can stretch over 20 feet long. These squids are so rare that fewer than 20 sightings have ever been recorded, and even those were blurry, distant shots. But there's no definitive proof that this is what it was, which means, as of right now, there may be something massive in the Mariana Trench that we haven't identified yet. In 2020, marine biologists identified a new species of amphipod living in one of the deepest parts of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. They named it Eurythensis plasticus, and that's because when scientists analyzed its body, they found plastic inside it. Specifically, they discovered a common material used in plastic bottles and food packaging. So even in the most remote and extreme environment on Earth, plastic pollution has again made its way into the food chain. The discovery was made by researchers from Newcastle University who were studying deep-sea amphipods, tiny shrimp-like creatures that scavenge for food on the ocean floor.